Good day once again. So my topic for today is about gamification and game-based learning with mobile learning games forward. Games can introduce goals, interactions, feedback, problem solving, competition, narrative, and fun learning environments. Elements that can increase learner engagement and sustain motivation. This teaching tips discusses the difference between gamification and game-based learning. The pedagogical values these two strategies can bring to instruction in game elements appropriate for face-to-face and online courses. Gamification versus game-based learning. A gamification and game-based learning are similar in that both strategies promote engagement and sustain motivation in learning. However, gamification and game-based learning can also be usefully distinguished. As what we have here, gamification is the integration of game elements like point system, leaderboards, badges, or other elements related to games into conventional learning activities in order to increase engagement and motivation. So for example, an online discussion forum for a physics course might be gamified via a badge system. A student might be rewarded a Ptolemy badge after they have made 10 posting, a Galileo badge after 20 posting, Kepler after 30, Einstein after 40, and so on. In ideal gamified learning environments, students can see the online badges that their peers have earned to create a sense of camaraderie or competition. The game-based learning, in contrast, it involves designing learning activities so that game characteristics and game principles inhere within the learning activities themselves. So for example, in an economics course, students might compete in a virtual stock trading competition. In a political science course, students might role play as they engage in mock negotiations involving a labor dispute. In short, gamification applies game elements or a game framework to existing learning activities, while game-based learning designs learning activities that are intrinsically game-like. Gamification and game-based learning both promote engagement and sustain motivation in learning, but they do not necessarily result in improved learning outcomes. Game elements and their pedagogical role. Most game features elements such as rules, goals, interaction, feedback, problem solving, competition, story, and fun. Though not all of the elements are needed to successfully gamify a learning activity, carefully selecting those elements that help meet the learning objectives of the course can be useful. The pedagogical value of game features often associated with gamification as may be discussed out later. Points or experience systems. Similar to conventional grading schemes, game points or experience system reward students for completing various tasks, assignments, or assessments. Game or XP points can introduce some useful affordances to learning environments, as what we have here, including limitless points, whereas traditional grading schemes collect artifacts of learning which accumulate to 100% of a course's grade. Points or XP system accumulate points with no fixed end in sight. Flexible goals. Students are presented with a wealth of possibilities to earn points, and instructors can structure the course so that they either accumulate as many as they want or they complete a certain number of tasks to reach a desired point total. Student choice, no? Choice is crucial to the success of a point-based system. For example, students might be able to earn points by focusing on reflection activities or by opting to complete a number of tests or any other activity relevant to the course. And tracking. You can track points by using Learn's gradebook features with points instead of percentages, or Google Drive to share the results with the entire class. Points can also be supplemented by academic rewards. When a certain point threshold is reached, a student might be given an extra week to submit an assignment or bonus questions on the next test. Badges. Badges are digital way to acknowledge student work. So for example, students might receive a badge if they achieve certain levels of success on assignments or if they do additional work, such as submitting a draft or sharing notes with other students. They may even be result of simple participation, like accessing the course through the LMS 5 times a week over the course of a semester could earn a badge. Student badges may be displayed to other learners in the class as a means to encourage competition or to demonstrate the variety of badges which can be earned. Leaderboards. Competition can motivate students and can be leveraged by leaderboards that showcase the distribution of point totals that students have accumulated through various learning activities. However, caution must be taken when constructing leaderboards because displaying all students in order of points totals can be a disincentive for students at the bottom. As mentioned by Farsen and Group, consider using a system in which students see only the two students who are directly above them and below them in order to foster a healthy sense of competition without discouraging students who are performing poorly. Online gamification strategies. Discussion boards. Students may be incentivized to discuss readings before or immediately after class by making them optional but allotting XP points for each post or reply to another post. Points earned could go toward additional help on an assignment, such as allowing a draft to be reviewed first or having an automatic extension granted, or to completely bypassing an assignment if the student reaches a certain number of points, they no longer have to complete a specific assignments in the course. And you can also facilitate real-time discussion using tools like Padlet or Today's Meet, each of which allows students to make anonymous contributions. Quizzes. Rather than presenting a set of seemingly unrelated questions, consider creating a narrative or quest that draws learners in and help them see the consequences of their responses. Think of your quiz as an interactive narrative. Each question leads into the next and may build upon previous answers, all the while being part of a larger narrative or story that compels the learner to remain engaged. You may even include hints that the learner can choose to use or not. Be cautious of making these high-stakes assessments. The game-like features of the task will be mitigated and potentially impaired should learners be focused too much on the grade attached. An alternative method is to have students complete a quiz in the online environment and then come to class, form groups, and complete the same quiz. But now try to convince one another of the correct answer. And this can be facilitated through different feedback assessment technique. Cards 2. In-class gamification strategies. We have what we call Jeopardy! Creating Jeopardy-style games for review of chapters or in preparation for a midterm can provide enjoyment and interaction with others in familiar game structure. Create a game using PowerPoint presentation or use a free Jeopardy game creator like Instant Jeopardy Review. Classroom response system. Gathering response from an entire class can be difficult, but doing so with classroom response system like Kahoot or Top Hat can encourage participation through game elements like points and competition between individuals. Out-of-class gamification strategies. Game-based learning environments. These include any game designed for educational purposes such as quiz app or trivia craft. As an instructor, you can make learners aware of these educational games, but the game itself acts as the educator. Game-enhanced learning environments. These environments employ commercially available games that are designed with entertainment in mind. Learners play these games for fun and must then be provided or find means by which to discuss gameplay experiences with like-minded individuals. As an instructor, your role can be to provide or invite examples of games that are related to the discipline. And importantly, provide the space of learners to reflect on their gameplay. Massive multiplayer online role-playing games like World of Warcraft or Second Life are great for immersing language learners in another language, or games like SimCity can help understand economic principles. Incorporating gamification, and game-based learning into your teaching doesn't require a monumental shift in your teaching. Many activities or active learning strategies that you already use like contain some of the game elements listed and mentioned earlier with some modification. It can be modified into even more effective learning tools. At the same time, gamification and game-based learning should not be implemented in a cavalier manner but should be thoughtfully integrated into a course. Here are some gamification and game-based learning tools. We have Duolingo. These games, no, a gamifying language learning by having students complete drill in skill, grammar, and vocabulary exercises while receiving experience points to gain levels and access more difficult exercises. All of us are familiar with Minecraft, a vernacular game that has been adapted for learning environments by giving students a sandbox to build and construct their own virtual worlds. We have Second Life, a virtual world where students can create their own avatar and embody a 3D space which can in turn promote easier communication through text and reduce anxiety to speak. We have Coursera, a platform that provides free educational courses for everyone who is interested, but to promote interactivity and retention. Badges and other reward systems are implemented for participants. We have Brainscape. It improved flashcards, no, that promote retention of knowledge using what they call confidence-based repetition, designed to be more appealing and fun to use to also assist in retentions. This will be my commonly used Kahoot, a classroom response system that is free to use and doesn't require students sign up. Simply create a game of Kahoot, entertain questions, or enter and questions, and supply the provided pin to your students, who will then use their phones or laptops to play the game and answer questions. We have Gridly, an open source badge making tool to create badges for tasks in your course, with the ability as well as to distribute badges to students as well. We have Open Badges, another open source badge making tool like Gridly, but is more complex to create badges with. Immediate Feedback Assessment Teacher. The if AT provides immediate feedback to learners on multiple choice questions by having a card that learners scratch to determine the correct answer, allows for collaboration when answering questions, and provides a sense of excitement when scratching the card. And Top Hat, a classroom response system like Kahoot that allows students to provide response to questions in the class anonymously. Unlike Kahoot, this has a fee associated with it, but it allows for better integration in the learning management system for grading purposes and has a tournament mode to encourage competition in class. Again, Top Hat is associated with fee. The notion of using video games for learning causes some to cringe, others to leap for joy, and many to ask questions about this learning medium. These questions often come from people and organizations that are considering delving into the world of learning games but don't know if this is advisable or don't know where to start. The goal of this discussion is to answer those questions about learning games and to help plot a path for people and organizations interested in developing or fostering the development of video games for learning. This discussion starts by making a case of learning games grounded in principles of good fun and good learning. From this discussion, it explores the commercial games market, gleaning lessons from this rapidly growing and diversifying place. In order to address the concerns of those who see edutainment as a dead market, this discussion analyzes the downfall of edutainment in the 1990s and establishes how the current movement differs. As there are many applications of games related to learning games, this discussion lays out the ecology of games with a purpose beyond play. Much of the rest of the discussion establishes principles and best practices for moving the field forward in a positive direction. This presentation should provide a good grounding in the field in both motivate and inform those wanting to participate in this rapidly growing domain. This is done by the Education Arcade of Massachusetts Institute of Technology by Eric Klopper, Scott Osterwell, and Katie Salen, with a contribution by Jason Haas, Jennifer Grove, and Dan Roy. Those who believe in using games in education usually start from a common set of assumptions. They observe that game players regularly exhibit persistence, risk-taking, attention to detail, and problem-solving skills, all behaviors that ideally would be regularly demonstrated in school. They also understand that game environments enable players to construct understanding actively and at individual paces, and that will design games enable players to advance on different paths at different rates in response to each player's interests and abilities, while also fostering collaboration and just-in-time learning. Even starting with this shared notion, advocates for game-based learning tend to adopt one of two very different approaches to designing games for formal education. One group sees the skill the students develop playing games as essential to a 21st century education, and conversely see little progress happening in schools still shock to 19th century factory model. They focus on the habits of mind and disposition needed to collaborate, innovate, problem solve, and communicate effectively in a knowledge-based economy. They observe with some accuracy that these skills can be all aligned or all be gained from engagement with commercial off-the-shelf games or through social networking, blogging, and other forms of user-generated content that fall under the larger banner of participatory culture. They focus on these skills open to the exclusion of traditional academic subject matter, and at least insofar as game-based learning is concerned. They assume the institution of school is highly resistant to reform and find alternative venues and opportunities to foster learning. They imagine the important learning will take place outside of school and question what value schools add to the process. Clearly, many cuts or many COTS or commercial off-the-shelf games provide opportunities for learning. Example vary from simulations such as Roller Coaster Tycoon or Civilization that require planning, quantitative skills, and significant analysis to massively multiplayer online role-playing games or MMORPGs like World of Warcraft or WoW or EVE Online, which promote communication, collaboration, and problem-solving skills. In contrast, the second group tends to concentrate only on applying games in traditional school setting with traditional methods and outcomes. They may pay lip service to 21st century skills, but they look at the learning that occurs in COTS games and ask, why can't we use the form of these successful games to instead foster learning in more traditional academic areas? In order to integrate games into the existing school environment, they must address several common concerns of teachers. Of course, their need to cover mandated content areas, a healthy skepticism of new technologies, of course, combined with a lack of infrastructure for these technologies, and an unfamiliarity with games and no easy route to game competence. In addition, proponents of games in school also have to overcome the objection of those parents, teachers, and administrators who see games as insufficiently serious that they are just play. The solution to all these difficulties tend to be the games that can be played in very short bursts of class time. Games should simplicity make them easy to grasp immediately. In games that are stopped with what can be recognized as factual content, often referred to as integrated learning system by Oppenheimer, and these games are offer curricular or open curricular, attempting to teach subject matter that is otherwise advanced through textbooks, lectures, or problem sets. Sadly, while they may go by the name games, they usually end up bearing little resemblance to the games mentioned above, the promoting learning of 21st century skills, instead being little more than interactive quizzes. The resemblance to a game is meaningless, then the activity is nothing more than answering multiple choice questions, and when success is measured solely as the percentage of correct answers given expressed as a score and presented with a fun animation. If the first group embraces games and abandons school, the second group often embraces school to the detriment of anything that looks like a real gaming. In spite of their striking differences, were pointedly avoided suggesting that these impulses to promote new modes of learning on the one hand and to adapt to the classroom on the other, are mutually exclusive. One might advocate that games can both build 21st century skills and channel those skills in traditional academic fields. One could also argue that just because such games might be in the service of school, they don't necessarily have to be designed to blend into outmoded forms of schooling. It is unfortunate that when talk turns to how games should be implemented in education, the models that are proposed tend to land heavily at one end of the spectrum or the other. We start with some sympathy for those who favored unrestrained gaming over schooling. We see enormous creativity in gamers. Gamers build business around clothes they create for their sims. Build tools for others to use to mine gold in WoW or World or Craft. Create novels around plots from favorite games like Final Fantasy and Zelda. Hack Wii controllers and mod their Alienware PC cabinet, engage in cosplay around their favorite game character, act as a tour guides for newbies and MMOs, trade virtual goods and earn a living doing it, and make films inside game engines. These films cover topics ranging from a player's love of the game of baseball, a perfect reenactment of the 10th inning of the Barker game in 1986, and reproduced to an obsession with snack foods, and it can be read as animated travelogue through GTA, but is the first and foremost a documentary of the day in the life of man, the player. However, technology alone does not create or encourage good learning and creative practice. We tend to believe that the children who make the most of these technologies do so in the context of families and communities of practice that support their efforts or at the very least have modeled some of the same disposition like the technology or the godparent from a Filipino fifth graders extended parenting network who purchases here a Nintendo DS and cell phone so that the girl can have access and learn how to use technology. There is insufficient evidence that this self-directed learning and creativity is the rule, not the exemption. For example, a study from the college or university, for example, of Michigan, of children using computer in public libraries suggested that disadvantaged children were far less likely to spend time with single application or sites and tended to skim surfaces rather than dive deeply. Structure and support from outside influences such as after-school program, parents and teachers in the classroom are needed for most kids to excel with these technologies. As such, we are not ready to concede there is no role for school in helping them make the most of these experiences. Quite the opposite, in fact, we believe schools can and should play a critical role in fostering learning in associations with gameplay. And while many schools may not be ready to immediately embrace this role fully, many of the existing assets, including structure, people, and goals of schools can contribute positively. Whatever the failings of school, the academic disciplines of math and science, history, literature, language study remain vitally important, as do the abilities to read critically and communicate persuasively both in and out of school. In all of these fields, talented teachers and researchers have identified pedagogical approaches that are forward-looking and well adapted to the changing environments of the internet age. Approaches that rely on the same thing or the same thinking skills that games exercise. There is no reason to believe that the kind of creative energy exhibited in game novels to theater to film all have a role in sparking interest and curiosity in students, as have informal experiences such as museum visits and competitive challenges such as science fairs. We are therefore prepared to argue that games can engage players in learning that is specifically applicable to schooling, and there are means by which teachers can leverage the learning in such games without disrupting the world of either play or school. To succeed, we must look at where the strengths and challenges of both classrooms in games lie and situate learning games at the most productive intersection of these separate environments. We will examine these issues through concrete example of existing best practices in speculative designs currently under development at education, arcade, and elsewhere. Last, it is important to acknowledge that games and learning has a story that predates the advent of modern video games, including a rich history in the design of children's software. This history has taught us several important things, not the least of which is that players determine how they learn. The productivity of gaming environment lies in the fact that kids among themselves are free to discover and create learning and teaching arrangements that work for them. So while it is important to understand how the qualities of games themselves support learning, it is equally critical to address how players take on active roles in determining how, when, and why they learn. The rule of play. The starkly obvious difference between games in traditional schooling is that good games always involve play and schooling rarely does. Before we discuss what constitutes playing games, it's worth stepping back to look at play in the broader sense to understand how learning environments can effectively incorporate play and how play often incorporates learning. Think for a moment about a child at play with dolls or action figures or Lego blocks. To the outsider, the play is likely to look somewhat scattered. The child will be working fiercely one moment constructing a building or acting out a story, and then just as abruptly the child will shift gears, knowing down what she's built, or hurling dolls across the room in gleeful enactment of imagined disasters. Whether the child has been exploring the physical nature of things, her nascent understanding of familial and social rules, or obliterating everything she's just accomplished, the child at play is exercising freedom along five distinct axes. Course number one, freedom to fail, freedom to experiment, freedom to fashion identities, freedom to export, and freedom of interpretation. Freedom to fail. One doesn't actually fail at play per se, but one is free to do things at play that would look like failures in other contexts. Think of the black tower that inevitably collapses, or the sand castle fated to disappear with the tide. At play, the child has unlimited freedom to undertake such doomed enterprises and learns as much about the nature of things from failure as from success. Every fall off a skateboard, every crumpled up drawing, every lost game of Candyland is a small failure. Fortunately, children at play don't have adults looming over them, fretting about the cause of these failures, and so children are free to learn from failure and moreover closer to mastery of their world. Freedom to experiment. This correlates closely with the freedom to fail, but suggests in addition that within the play space the player has some room to maneuver and invent new approaches to whatever task is at hand. It isn't sufficient that the child can build towers with blocks, but in fact that he can engage in a wide array of activities with those blocks, experimenting with uses he has invented for himself. Experimentation would be meaningless without the ability to fail regularly, and the freedom to fail would amount to little if players were constrained in where they could seek that failure. Freedom to fashion identities. At play, the child isn't simply examining the nature of the physical and social worlds, but is also exploring his identity in those worlds. That identity is not a fixed thing, but rather something that it is held in play. Using dolls, a child will try out the rules of both mischievous child and stern parent. In fairy tales, children imagine what it means to be dragon and what it means to slay one. The child is practicing when to be aggressive, when cooperative, when assertive, and when docile. Only by trying on these identities do children begin to define themselves. Freedom of effort. Watching children play tag, Peter and Iona Opie, notice that a child will run vigorously for 20 minutes to evade the tag, and then abruptly stop in the middle of the schoolyard to receive the tag. Do you observe that children regularly exhibited this pattern of alternating between intense and relaxed play? It is easy to overlook this quality of play, but if we stop to imagine play in which a uniform effort is expected, we quickly sense the presence of controlling adult. Freedom of interpretation. Learning about games and learning with games take place simultaneously. One cannot learn about or from games without engaging in their play, yet we must always remember that there is no one game. The individual, social, and cultural motivations of any player affect what is experienced through play, and no two players ever experience the same game. This creates a challenge for those looking to games to provide a standardized context for learning. Play and games. What we're what we've largely described above is free play. The sort of play a child pursues entirely on his own terms. This play has no agenda and the child goals are entirely intrinsic and personal. Games by contrast tend to have defined goals. Most games have winning stakes, and even those that don't end in victory usually have clear ways of demarcating success through points or other quantifiable outcomes. In addition, games have rules that structure the play and that guarantee fairness by being applied transparently and equitably to all players. At first blush, games with their rules constraints and externally defined goals seems to be at odds with the freedoms of play. But within the prescribed space of a game, players regularly exhibit all of the freedoms of unstructured play. Most players undertake games in the knowledge that failure is a possibility. They show a willingness to experiment in their gameplay and to try on different rules from leader to follower, novice to expert. Finally, the freedom of effort described above remains present in any voluntary game. By offering challenges that seem worth attempting, games channel players' effort while still affording them the freedom needed to manage their individual experience in ways that are self-directed and beneficial to their own development. In games, children submit to arbitrary rules and structures, but only if they can continue to be playful. The promise of games is that we can harness the spirit of play to enable players to build new cognitive structures and ideas of substance. Last, in defining games, It is important to discuss the link between play in games, which is the act of gaming. For the purposes of the paper discussion, gaming constitutes the sum total of activities, literacies, knowledge, and practices activated in and around any instance of a game. Gaming is play across media, time, social spaces, and network of meaning. It includes engage with digital FAQ or frequently asked questions, paper game guides, parents and siblings, the history of games, other players, as well as the games themselves. It requires players to be fluent in a series of connected literacies that are multimodal, performative, productive, and participatory in nature. It requires an attitude oriented toward risk-taking, meaning creation, nonlinear navigation, problem solving, an understanding of rule structures, and an acknowledgement of agency within that structure, to name but a few. Gaming also required what J. Limke and others have referred to as a stance of playfulness, a cognitive attitude tied directly to the creative, improvisational, and subversive qualities of play. Weng Senga would call this the losery attitude, the attitude required of players in order to play. To play a game in many ways an act of faith that invests the game with special meaning. Without willing players, the game is formal system waiting to be inhabited like a recipe for baking or choreographer's score. As design system, games offer certain terms of engagement, rules of play that engender stylized forms of interaction. Gamers not only follow rules but push against them, testing the limits of the system in open, unique, and powerful ways. Yet, it is the moment when pushing against is transformed into a meta-reflective questioning about that learning truly takes place. Play and adults. In providing the above examples, we've stuck with description of young children at play, as it is in childhood that the features of play are most easily recognized, but the same freedoms are visible in the play of adults. Mastering the most adult of games, golf, would be impossible without the ability to fail open and quietly spectacularly. And no one would get good at poker if they couldn't experiment or try on different identities. Anyone who regularly plays tennis knows that sometimes you come to play hard and sometimes you decide to relax and just volley. Without the five freedoms of play, none of these activities would be worthy of the name leisure. The prototypical game or gamer and other myths. The world of learning games is currently reaping the benefits not only of conceptual advances in the way designers and developers are linking learning in gameplay in the world of commercial games, but also from the rapid advances in the video games industry. For many years, the advances in the video game industry were primarily reserved for higher bits and resolutions, but the last several years have seen great technical and conceptual advances in video game designs, which ultimately can contribute greatly to the cost of learning games. The rise of the Nintendo DS and Wii platforms, as well as casual online and cell phone games, have shown that video games can take many forms and reach diverse audiences. This is critical for the learning game sector in that it cannot be resigned to serving narrow privileged audiences. Instead, they need to be able to reach learners of all types. These next generation ideas are already inspiring educational innovation and demonstrate that educational games have learned a lot at this around. These changes in the commercial world of games are critical for understanding the world of educational games for a number of reasons. First, the changes in commercial games have opened up new audiences that are greatly expanding the potential reach of educational games. As noted earlier, titles like Brain Age, Wi-Fit, and Dinner Dash all contain engaging game mechanics that are ripe for adaptation within both normal and informal learning environments. Second, these changes have expanded the types of educational games that are feasible, growing the conceptual areas that they can reach. This is due in part to greater experimentation with content in game mechanics that resulted from an expansion of technologies in game genres. Third, they are changing the perception of the nature of video games, making them more accepted in a greater diversity of places. For example, gaming is becoming part of activities now a regular activity in senior centers, in libraries, and in museums, as well as within the workplace, as in the case of companies like IBM, who have developed game-like training programs in virtual environments for their employees. And finally, they are providing cheaper and easier ways to reach everyone, making open access to games a reality. As the video game industry has sought new markets for their games, they had to create new business model as well, which have dropped price points and led to the creation of smaller, more affordable games. Many casual online games, for example, can be played for free, and the typical cost of Nintendo DS game cartridge ran 19.99 US dollar rather than the 49.99 US dollar cost of console games. Yet despite the numerous ways in which the gaming market itself has started to open up, many people considering diving into the educational games market, either as producer of games or as consumers, are often reluctant to enter because they feel that they are not gamers and are turned off by their perception of modern video games. This perception of what games are continue to cast a heavy shadow over the games and learning space. For example, to many, a game is a first-person 3D immersive experience in which the player is executing missions in a dark world, either through an avatar or perhaps a vehicle. There is a lot of shooting and explosion and massive budgets behind the immersive world. The game may be single-player or multiplayer, but involves hundreds of hours of games played to reach any level of mastery. These games are played by gamers who have high-end, game-tuned computers and peripheral gaming skills that they have developed through near countless hours of gameplay, and the disposable time in which to invest in these games. Statistically speaking, these gamers are young males, okay, based on McFarlane, Sparrowhawk, and Herald noong 2002. This game exists, the gamers also exist. However, they actually present a small minority of the gaming community. In recent 2006 Parks Associate study of Americans who play games, they define a number of types of gamers based on their playing habits. And of course, they includes power gamers, who are the prototypical gamers mentioned above, social gamers who enjoy gaming as a way to interact with friends, leisure gamings mainly play casual titles, nevertheless they prepare challenging titles and show high interest in new gaming services. Dormant gamers, we have incidental gamers lack motivation and plays games mainly out of boredom. Dormant gamers love gaming but spend little time because of family, work, or school. They like to play with friends and main family and prefer complex and challenging games. And occasionally gamers play puzzle, word, and board games almost exclusively. So, where did you belong here? Okay? We have sea changes, okay? Or sea changes platform. In the first few years, or in the last few years, the industry has begun to respond to this diverse community, led primarily by Nintendo's DS handheld and Wii console. The notion of many types of games for many types of gamers has begun to be embraced. This platform have begun to redefine the nature of games, opening up the possibility for new kinds of games in the marketplace and putting powerful and expensive platforms in the hands of tens of millions of people. Not so many years ago, Nintendo was chastised for not shifting its market focus from young kids to teens and young adults as the PlayStation. Meanwhile, Nintendo Games Cube languished and the Game Boy platform was looking pretty dated. Nintendo's first move was to introduce the Nintendo's DS, a new handheld, and introduce a second screen to the Game Boy platform. This screen was touch sensitive, allowing the user to press on the screen with a stylus to game as personal digital assistants had done for years. The introduction of the touch-sensitive screen along with a new wireless capability that allowed players to play in network multiplayer mode allowed Nintendo to create games with interesting and more intuitive controls. While the market of traditional mobile gamers could use the typical buttons to control games, other games took advantage of the touchscreen to create games that appealed to girls and broader adult audiences. Nintendogs was an early success that brought both girls and adults to the platform. This game challenged players to care for a virtual dog that lived on the DS. Caring, the, caring for the dog required a combination of petting it on the touch-sensitive screen, giving it verbal commands using the built-in microphone, and even taking it for walks where they could interact with other Nintendogs. It facilitated by the built-in wireless networking. Introduction of these multiple styles of play appealed to a broader audience and providing an indication to the games industry that they were untapped models for games and corresponding untapped audiences. The casual online games. One of the fastest growing markets in the United States and perhaps the world is in casual games. These are games that can be played for a few minutes at the time and are easily learned. They can be parts of real-world analog games like Heart of Scrabble, as well as original computer games like Beachy World. The single biggest demographic for casual online games are women between the ages of 35 and 50. This market is huge with nearly 40% household engaged in 2007 and growing rapidly. This model is important for the world of learning games because it demonstrates the way that many non-traditional gamers like to play games. They play for short periods of time in games that are simple, fun, and ubiquitously available. And they really are ubiquitous. Many casual games are played on cell phones, which have found a good match between the simple interface available, the time people have, and simple but compelling gameplay. There is compelling evidence that learning games should at least look to the segment as much as they do to the hardcore gaming models in order to engage large audiences. When a game is not a game. While there is quite a bit of debate in academic circles over the exact nature of games, of course, definitions typically include combination of rules, goals, and feedbacks, fantasy, and fun. There are some commonly agreed on relatives of games that are clearly not games, despite the agreement of experts on the exclusion of these related categories. They often get lumped in with games anyway, simply because they may be fun and involve new media. Primary among These are social networks and virtual works. The social network phenomenon has taken off in the last few years, initially fueled by the powerhouse Facebook and MySpace, which teens and college students have used to connect with their friends. Social networks now include just about every corporate application, as well as niche applications that connect hobbyists and alumni alike. While networking with friends, colleagues, and people of similar interests is in many cases fun, it lacks most of these criteria that would make it a game. Certainly, social networking, like just about any activity, can be tuned into a game. Many games can be embedded in social networking application as well. The popular game Scabulous, no, or Scrabble clone can be embedded in Facebook pages and played through a social network. Oh, this will be an avatar is playing about in Second Life. The boom in bust and boom of educational games. The history of computer-based learning games has a story arc that rises dramatically and then plummets steeply. In the early days of personal computers in 1980s, creative minds drawn to the new medium explore a variety of approaches to learning games, ranging from behaviorist drill and practice exercises to open-ended environments suitable for either exploration or construction. Early practitioners were inventing new forms, and even the fundamentally limited drill and practice games were infused with a measure of creative energy and humor. For users of these early products, his new title represented another interesting step into unknown territory. We started from the CD-ROM era. These products were first delivered on the floppy disk and marketed alongside pure entertainment games in the few computer stores of the time. As the educational titles proliferated, they spawned their own industry complete with the mail-order catalogs for parents and teachers. This era came to crashing halt in the early 1990s with the sudden emergence of web browser opening up the internet and all of its freely content to average users. The gold rush mentality that previously animated CD publishing was abruptly redirected toward the internet. And in that early delirium of the dot-com boom, content was suddenly offered for free online in the hope that money-making models would eventually emerge. Lego was a particularly strong player in this arena, recognizing the potential of web-based experiences to extend the brand and narrative worlds of their product, including games. Games and other products for children were a major part of this mix of web-served content, putting great stress on the market for shrink-wrap, CD-based software. As was characteristic of many markets that emerged during the internet boom, products were rapidly produced so that companies could be the first movers. This left little room for the time-intensive development of learning games. The sinking edutainment ship. The final factor in the perfect storm was the rising demand by buyers for products narrowly focused on improving school performance. Drill and practice led by the Math Blaster and Reader Rabbit line of products was always a large component of the industry, but the appearance of the Jumpstart series represented a turning point. The product name appealed perfectly to parents, anxieties that other people's children were getting a jump start on education and all the future rewards that would follow in these trains. We have barriers. Any story of the promise of educational gamers or games must attend to the barriers slowing or stopping their development and adoption. These barriers come from various sectors including industry, academia, the market, schools, and even kids themselves. It is a story that begins with the emergence of the children's software industry in the 80s and 90s as what we mentioned earlier. Then as now, schools were slow to adopt new innovation and were unable to make the organizational and instructional changes necessary to make good use of new learning technologies. Then as now, uncertain markets made investment in educational game risky, particularly for entertainment-focused video game industry. Then, as now, the knowledge around effective play patterns for certain kinds of learning was limited, narrowing the scope of types of games being made. Then, as now, designing a good game was difficult, educational or not. Now, as then, we face many challenges, but now we have this past experience and new knowledge and know-how that provides the potential for a new take on learning games. Recognizing the types of barriers facing the educational games space is important. For while not insurmountable, these barriers pose significant challenges and can only be overcome by coordinated effort by funders, developers, schools, parents, and kids. These barriers include but not limited to excuse, barriers to adoption. Number one, curriculum requirements. Historically, schools have been reluctant to give up textbook or purchase educational technologies that are either not clearly linked to state standards or that have not proven their efficacy. As a result, K-12 curriculum standards lock down the curriculum, leaving no space for adoption. Next is attitude. Some parents and educators have negative attitude about video games, which are reinforced by a limited dialogue in the media around the relative merits of video games broadly. These attitudes take on a different flavor in the chocolate broccoli problem. Kids, particularly preteens, tweens, and teens, shy away from games they are told are good for them or labeled as educational. Logistic. Educators often find it difficult to integrate the play of game into the time structure of school day, which is often ruled by 45-minute classes. In some schools, access to computers is too limited for games to play a mainstream role in learning. For mobile games, the ban on mobile phones and other portable devices in school is a large barrier to entry. Support for teachers. Most teachers have little experience in integrating games into the classroom, and professional development programs most often do not include support in this area. Teachers lack the time, incentives, and support for this work. Assessment. While games may be especially good for teaching highly ordered skills, these skills are not typically assessed in standardized exams. New frameworks for assessment of these skills must be developed if games are to be leveraged within the performance-driven culture of most schools. Evidences. While this is changing, not enough studies have been done to date showing that learning games are effective. Without this evidence, the attitude and barriers discussed earlier will be slow to change. Uses of games. Example of how games can be integrated into a range of curricular experiences is crucial. A limited set of these models exists currently. Limited view. People often have a limited view of the variety of games available, which narrows expectation around the viability of games to engage students. Social and cultural structures. Existing social and cultural structures around education, school, learning, and play make the uptake of educational games challenging. These structures are incredibly difficult and slow to change and pose perhaps the greatest challenge to the educational games space. Barriers, design, and development, or barriers to design and development. Of course, another thing is high development costs. Video games are expensive to make and maintain. Uncertain markets makes investment a high risk for the video game industry in educational material companies, who then face most of the barriers to adoption described earlier. Development process. Most video game companies have specialized development processes that rarely include collaboration with learning scientists, teachers, or youth development specialists. The process is driven by the bottom line market concerns, and it is easy to cut out aspects of the game valued by educators such as reading and writing. Playtesting in schools. It is difficult for game development companies to gain access to classroom in other educational contexts in which their games might be played. This limits the effectiveness of their internal evaluation process, and which demands play of their product by their target audience. Limited sources of funds. Limited sources of funding. While this is starting to change, lack of funding for educational game development or the creation of educational game companies from venture capitalists, mezzanine funders, or banks limits the growth of the field. As noted in the recent discussion, this adversity to risk-taking is deafening by past experience of firms that lost investments in the educational technology markets. The next will be barriers to sustainability. Gamers are fickle. Gamers, like kids, change what they play for a variety of reasons, and loyalty to a product can be hard to find, particularly for games that lack cultural or social catch or replayability. This factor can impact the shelf life of a game. Speed of change. Technology changes so quickly that platforms are outdated quickly, exacerbating the funding challenge described above. Maintenance and support. Games, especially those that are networked, require ongoing support, which can be costly. Funding often is not provided for this aspect of development. Barriers to innovation. Limited data. Because there has not been to date much reporting on gameplay data by groups outside of the video game industry, the field has become locked into commercial industry data on demographics in genre. Limited pedagogical paradigms. Standard approaches to pedagogy in the classroom differ significantly from models present in games. Effective use of games and other new technologies is likely to be limited unless educational institutions are willing to consider significant changes in pedagogy and content and rethink the role of teachers and other educational professionals. Limited on research. In addition to the limited research into the form of games as learning environment, there is an equal lack of work being done in the area of effective play patterns for learning. We don't yet know enough about the range of play patterns available for certain kinds of learning. Limited ambitions. Funded projects are often not ambiguous enough. They are tested with small numbers of players and don't scale. No scale means no impact. The ecology of games with a purpose beyond play. While the edutainment industry declined in the late 1990s, interest in using games for purposes besides entertainment started to grow again early in the 2000s, with new models, new ideas, and new goals that overcome or simply go around the obstacle that challenge the industry. The rise of the serious games movement began in earnest around that time, fueled primarily by interest in using games for military purposes ranging from recruitment on training frontline personnel. And we have two popular games emerged, Full Spectrum Warrior and America's Army. So we have here the taxonomy of serious games developed by Ben Sauer and Peter Smith. So we have here the for government, for defense, for healthcare, marketing communication, for education, corporate, and industry. Learning games. Game versus school, the freedoms of play. The freedom of plays are present even in mediocre games, yet they are all too rare in school. Unquestionably, the best teachers try to foster learning environments where children are free to pursue learning in open and exploratory ways through what is traditionally defined as constructivist learning. Yet, the institution of school, as currently constructed, militates against the exercise of those freedoms. The emphasis on grades and high-stakes testing leave few opportunities for failure or varied effort. Experimentation doesn't even make into the one place one would expect to find it. The traditional science class, where laboratories are usually done according to rigid recipes with preordained outcomes. The need for classroom order and regularity rule out the possibility of playing with one's identity. Game as engines or authoring platforms or authoring system. In the scenario, students use games to produce an artifact, be it game, a mod like StarCraft, a video or machinima in WoW, The Sims, The Second Life, and others. A visual text like Sims Family Album, an avatar like Miss, a written text like Milk, an SMS-based game platform, or a body of code or Alice or Scratch. Rubrics for evaluation of these artifacts come not from the game, but from the design domain to which the artifact is related, as well as from the kinds of understanding the artifact was produced to express. Commercial off-the-shelf games, web-based games, can be used, as well as software platforms or virtual worlds with games embedded. Game as content or content system. In this scenario, COTS or other games are used to deliver understanding about a particular subject or content area. For example, a student plays SimCity to learn about urban planning or Civilization to learn about history. When games are used this way, students must be provided with opportunities for reflection on and discussion of the contents in the spaces external to the game in order to allow students to see the game as part of a larger body of knowledge on that subject. We have also game assimilation, a manipulating system. In this scenario, games are valued as dynamic system with which students can test theories about how systems work, as well as how certain principles of dynamic system can be observed and played out. So for example, a student may play Bridge Builder to learn about bridges as system of engineering, or use Soda Play as a way to test out physics-based theories. Animal Crossing could be played in order to have students work with elements of a capitalist economy. In Cheddar games can be played to have students reenact situation or scenarios as a way to see how the system can be affected by manipulating certain efforts. Simulation often include their own internal assessment measures that can be used to assess student understanding of both micro and macros element. Commercial off-the-shelf games can be used as well as web-based simulation tools or downloadable software. We have game as text or trigger system. In this scenario, games are used to create an experiential context for understanding around a topic, issue, or principle that a teacher can build on. Game as technology gateway or gateway system. In this scenario, games are used as a way to give students experience with technology, whether this is learning how to use a particular piece of software or platform, or kind of technology like mobile phones, wireless devices, writing, programming, and so on. Assessment model would be based on the effectiveness of student with a system and their ability to use the system to do what they want it to. Game as illustration. In this scenario, games are used as context for student reflection. Game as exemplar of point of view. In this scenario, games are a student to take on certain identities and associated points of view. A student might play an RPG where they have to choose to play both a good and bad character and compare differences in strategy, choice, and values held by those characters. Teachers might ask students to use a theater game to reenact a familiar scenario but told from several points of view, with the goal of each character being to shape the outcome of the scenario in their favor. Game as code words or code system. In this scenario, students use writing as a primarily mechanic of gameplay, whether they are playing text adventures or designing or playing text-based mobile games. The emphasis here is in the use of writing as both a mode of action and expression, because writing itself is produced as an artifact of the gameplay. This writing can be assessed to capture student understanding, and there is an opportunity to connect this approach to games with the introduction of programming curriculum that may use authoring platforms like Scratch or Alice or virtual worlds that support object creation like Second Life. Game as documentary. In this scenario, the play of a game is used as documentary evidence of student ideas, understanding. So for example, students may be asked to play The Sims in such a way as to recreate certain social scenarios that they are interested in. Machinima or storyboarding with screenshots can be used to capture the details of the situation, which then can be used as the basis for additional discussion or reflection. Game as text. In this scenario, games are read as text that express certain underlying ideologies, values, and beliefs. In the same way, the Uncle Tom's Cabin can be read as an expression of the antebellum South. Animal Crossing can be played and analyzed as an expression of the 20th century capitalism. Chess can be played and analyzed as a game about territorial conflict, or diplomacy as a model of the intricacies of international diplomacy. When games are used this way, students must be provided with opportunities for reflection on a discussion in spaces external to the game and ideally in relation to other media. Game as research. In this scenario, students design games as a research activity which produce material to be used in later learning experiences. Because a designer must be knowledgeable about the system he or she is designing. Using game design in this way requires students to think through how their players are learning and what they need to know about the subject of the game. In this way, students not only research materials to be used but also edit this material and are introduced to issues around credibility and point of view. Different kinds of research methods can be introduced as part of the work as well. Game as assessment. In this scenario, games can be used as environment for assessing student learning of curricular content or state standards. For example, a student might play Quest Atlantis to show their understanding to certain science concept, or they might play the Milk game that centers on answering questions around certain academic content. Here is an example of a screenshots from the website of Dimensions showing a embodied math problem in the sky that is baking educational games. This one is a Ted Castronova's game, Arden, the world of William Shakespeare, which in his own words, sucked. The role of the ivory tower. Academia has a critical role in fostering the growth of the games industry, in the educational games sector in particular. Academia is the source of innovation. The commercial games industry just doesn't have the budget, staffs, configuration, history, or even the motivation to provide consistent innovation. A single failure can set a large company back quite a ways and likely bankrupt a smaller company. That is where academia can help. We can take risks and make mistakes. We can try the high-risk project that has a chance at being at next big disruptive success but could also just fizzle. We can pilot and test new ideas just to learn more. And of course, we must provide value to our funders and partners. But that value comes in the form of both our products and our learnings. Academia should not be perceived as the cheap alternative to commercialized production, but rather an important place for innovation as well as idea and technology generation. These are integral components to pushing the educational games movement forward. In turn, academics should consider how and when to forge partnership with commercial entities and other facets of industry to both facilitate flow of knowledge. In this way, we maximize value to our funders and to the community at large. Learning game design principles. Silver bullets aside, there are a number of principles that we should be looking to in order to advance the field of educational games. At present, these are too few models for educational games, and what models we do have are imperfect. We can both improve existing models and create many new ones if we broadly think about these principles. Number one is choose wisely. While games are a powerful and exciting medium that many people and organizations are expressing interest in, they aren't perfect for everything. Games work well for many audiences, topics, and contexts, but they may not be the best tools for all audiences and all topics in all contexts. Sometimes the limitation in creating a good game for a particular topic is creativity and ingenuity of the design team. With a score in the name game attached to it, one must consider what is about this topic that may be appropriate as the basis of games. Think small, or sometimes. The typical vision of educational games at this time are massive 3D multiplayer games. There are many reasons why one might choose this kind of environment and style of play, but there are also reasons why one shouldn't choose this style. Sometimes the right choice is to make a small casual game because that style of play meets the learning goals of the activity. Other times, it might be useful to create a smaller prototype of a game to test the fundamental concept before embarking on a major development effort. AAA educational games or AAA entertainment games. Many developers are scared of from the developing educational games because they are convinced that the economics don't work. Commercially successful video games cost many million or tens of millions of dollars to create. It is difficult to imagine an educational market that would be able to support those costs. But that doesn't mean that an economically viable educational games market is a pipe dream. Put learning gameplay first. Many traditional instructional designers will ask whether a particular learning game was developed by creating the technology first and then choosing the learning goal that seemed to fit well with the technology, or whether the learning goals were defined first and then the appropriate technology was created to fit that goal. The answer to this question should be no. Neither of these should come first, as they should both be considered simultaneously. The former approach is likely to create a game where the learning goals feel grafted onto the game, as well as the game that doesn't have a coherent set of learning equally accessible to developers, nor does it recognize that gameplay is critical element of design and similarly goals content and the gameplay at the same time with enough flexibility to iterate between the two to change one or both simultaneously. Of course, this comes with bounds on the iteration. There may be some fixed set of constraints on both the technology and learning goals that are unchangeably, and of course, sometimes the combination just won't work. Find the game in the content. In designing any learning game, it is also too tempting to simply graft academic content onto existing forms. Castranovas ardent attempts to situate Shakespeare's world in a traditional role-playing game. Dimension M graphs algebra equation of the first-person shooter. While these projects may work, we prefer a different approach. We believe that any in academic discipline, there are elements that are fundamentally game-like. Break the mold for where educational games are played. Think about playing them outside the class and discussion school. Harness the great soft skill learning from games but connect it with content. Layering of access of work to work, specialization, mastery in specialized and not standardized connected to especially is need to create conditions for moments not just of mastery but also virtuously, competition and status, sharing and recommendation, retrieving and sharing feedback as form of assessment, appreciation and validation, collective external artifacts produced, and distribution of expertise and knowledge across the community of practice. Don't ignore nor be too limited by teacher training and readiness, of course. Play everywhere and anywhere. The traditional approach to playing games in the classroom is to play games in the classroom. Mobile games played on the cell phones, PDAs, or iPads are becoming more common and more sophisticated. Reduce, reuse, and recycle. Define the learning goals, of course, and forge partnership between academia, commercial companies, nonprofits, foundation, and government. Don't ignore or be too constrained by academic or state standards. And not just who, but what, where, and when, and why. Example, while the field of learning games is still nascent, there are some good examples already emerging that demonstrate unique aspect and show the potential of the approach. The first one will be the so-seen investigator. The Susan Investigator or ZSI is a game played on location at the Columbus Zoo. This location-based game is built on the MIT's outdoor augmented reality platform. AR, games engage participants in activities that combine real-world experience with additional information supplied to them by handheld computers. Palmagotchi. The mobile game Palmagotchi, developed by the MIT Scholar Teacher Education Program, combines the ideas of virtual pets and the evolutionary story of Darwin finches in the Galapagos Islands. Players maintain families of birds and island of flowers. They monitor and feed birds in order to keep them alive. They also mate their birds with other players' birds in order to get offspring with desirable traits that maximize their chances of surviving various hazard games. This game is designed to be school-friendly, so it is placed to require interaction every 3 or 4 hours as not to disrupt classes and others. Racing Academy. It allows students to access accurate, real-time models of how cars work in the context of a racing game. Ayete, The Cost of Life, of course. Game Star Mechanic. And Making History, The Calm in the Storm. We have Mine Rover, the Europa project. It helps players learn to program, actually. No? Specifically, players code artificial intelligence for robotic vehicles to help them navigate, no? Obstacle courses and overcome other challenges. The programming interface involves dragging logical pieces of the robot mechanics and setting a few parameters. For each one, there are no lines of code. An updated version of the game allows players to export sets of instructions to actual robots, enabling real-world competition. The game encourages an exploratory approach to learning programming, helping players get programs running quickly so they can experiment and iterate. Lure or the Labyrinth. The target audience is middle school students, and its primary goal is to enhance of pre-algebra math learning with a secondary goal of improving literacy. It is a long-form puzzle adventure game played over many sessions with a persistent narrative that evolves over time. Opening up learning games. With all of the many advantages and opportunities that learning games present, come in nearly equally number of barriers slowing or stopping their development and adoption. Overcoming these barriers will take a whole way that openness. One way to create that community is through by making it open, but the question remains in what way that openness needs to be manifest to create, grow, and sustain that community. Open is simultaneously an ideology, a practice, and a price. Each of these has implications for potential developers or contributors, end users, and other funders that make these initiatives possible. So we have open standard and APIs. We have open source engines, open content, open communities, and open access. With regards to the rule of foundation, there are a number of rules that foundation can play in this process and need to play if learning games are to realize their potential for change. Be voices of change. Clearly, all of these challenges are too big to take on without broad support from communities, schools, and government. Foundation can help in spreading the word and garnering additional support at all levels. Create communities. Help to create communities of varied partners that can help to solve some of these problems collectively and forge new partnership. Seed infrastructure development. Some of the above challenges requires APIs, engines, or other technical infrastructure to build upon. While some of this exists already in some stage of development, it may need to be improved, supported, or created. Create examples. Funding small projects to provide examples of both new creative educational ideas as well as new models of development sustainability can go a long way when shared with community. And research new models. There needs to be a new research into models of development, marketing, and sustainability. The issue surrounding IP ownership in the creative communities needs to be better understood, and new models that take into account in digital age need to be created. Stepping forward. This grand vision of the integration of gaming culture with school culture will require a tremendous effort on the part of all involved, including schools, parents, academics, government agencies, non-profit agencies, gaming professionals, and others. Providing access for all students to the kind of playful, investigative, collaborative, and well-rounded education that we envision in this document or discussion will necessarily depend on school culture and gaming culture coming to a respectful, mutual understanding on comfortable integration. Certainly, teachers in school will have to take brave risks to innovate, but the learning games community will need to meet schools understanding the constraint on the system and individual teachers. This community must listen to schools' concerns and need as well as observe and notice areas where it can help. This might include working to find the right way or ways to assess the hard and soft skills that students acquired through gaming so that leaders and innovators within schools have the right evidence to show their various governing and regulatory bodies. Teachers must have access to the training in support they required to feel safe taking risks in their classroom. We must all learn the mistake of the past and avoid repeating them. And finally, we must strive to push the boundaries of what games can be, in form and in function. As games move from being solely a technological tool to becoming a persuasive culture of play, we may yet unlock generations of curious, confident investigators and collaborators. And this will be my references. So from Person, Landers, Van der Crosses, from uwaterloo.ca, the Education Arcade of Course, Baker, Bell, Federation of American Scientists, E2M, Jerkins, Kirimure, McFarlane, Mook, Monroe, Newman, Opie, Oppenheimer, Roberts, and so on. Schemer, Schwartz, no, Schutz, Square, Words, and others. Thank you to all my references. Again, I hope you are now interested to support and to develop games. Thank you for watching and God bless everyone.